There were a couple studies done about 10 years ago at Texas A&M where they looked at ground beef, grass finish versus grain finish, and these results were equivocal. In fact, the grain finish guys did a little bit better. Now, are there data out there that would sway us or support us to choose one over the other? The scientific literature shows, very few studies. Texas A&M did a study, I think, back in 2010 where they looked at grain finished versus grass finished meat, and they looked at some biomarkers, which, again, I don't think biomarkers are particularly compelling data to dictate what we should do with regard to health, but they looked at things like HDL, triglycerides, I think LDL, and blood pressure. And in that study, the results were pretty similar, not much difference, and in fact, the grain finish was slightly better. Texas A&M did a study a few years back where they actually compared grass-fed and grain-finished beef on biomarkers, looking at things like blood pressure, HDL, LDL, and triglycerides, I think. And they saw really no difference, in the people who now these people weren't on a carnivorous diet, but they saw basically no difference. And in fact, I think that study slightly favored grain-finished beef. Human studies, and there have been a few studies comparing grain-finished and grass-finished, showing one to be superior over the other. Texas A&M University did a study looking at grass-fed versus grain-fed animals, looking at biomarkers like lipoproteins, cholesterol, and blood pressure, and they saw that the grain-fed was almost identical to the grass-fed. In fact, the grain-fed was a little bit better in that regard. Texas A&M did a couple studies a few years ago looking at some biomarkers, blood lipids, and the difference were not really different at all. I mean, even the grain-fed was even slightly better. Texas A&M in 2010 did a study looking at this specifically because they wanted to look at, because there's very little human data comparing the two. And they did a study looking at ground beef. One group was given ground beef that was grain finished, and one group was given ground beef that was grass finished. And they basically just assessed a few things. It was like I think blood pressure, HDL, triglycerides, and some other biomarkers, and there was really minimal to no difference. In fact, the grain-finished beef came out slightly more favorable. Texas A&M did a study on this a couple years ago looking at this specifically. There's very little human data where we've actually looked at humans that eat grass-finished versus grain-finished and see what happens to them. And the study they did, was looking basically at biomarkers. It was mostly looking at blood lipids and I think blood pressure. And there was no significant difference between the two. And in fact, the grain-finished group had a slight advantage. The grain-finished guys did a little bit better. In fact, the grain finish was slightly better. In fact, I think that study slightly favored grain-finished beef. In fact, the grain-fed was a little bit better in that regard. Even the grain-fed was even slightly better. The grain-finished beef came out slightly more favorable. In fact, the grain-finished group had a slight advantage. Bobby, I'm a huge proponent of beef. I mean, obviously, I eat a lot of it. I promote. I think everybody should eat more of it at least. And you talk about agribusiness, and certainly there's no shortage of that in the beef industry. We look at Tyson Foods, we look at Cargill, we look at what is it, JS or JBS, the other food company, the big processors. And when I look at, and I've actually interacted a little bit with the NCBA, and I'm just wondering, because they represent all of beef, and they represent the packers as much as they represent the ranchers, and so they represent all of beef, and they represent the packers as much as they represent the ranchers, and so there's kind of a maybe everyone's goals are not aligned. Maybe everyone's goals are not aligned. How do you guys interact with the NCBA, or is that something that is maybe delicate to talk about, or what's been their response to what you guys are preaching, or do they even give you the time of day, or what's the deal with the NCBA?